So, Dom, what do we do with the empty tomb? Paul in 1 Corinthians 15 says Christ died and was buried,
Yeah.
and leaves it at that. He doesn't give any narrative or any hint he knows about an actual tomb. Mark, the first gospel, gives us a tomb story. Is this a well-known trope to have empty tombs, or is it literally historical?
As a trope, let me give you the trope. One of the earliest, and probably the first novel, I think is the right word, by Cariton of Aphrodisias, Calirohe, when he has murdered his wife, actually, but when she's in the tomb, he comes repentant to the tomb. He finds the tomb open, and people go in and say, she's gone. And then he goes in and finds his wife's body, let's say, is gone. Now, two conclusions are drawn from that. Two options, let me say, are drawn from that. One is grave robbery, where everyone says, well, yeah, we expect the robbers to take all the good stuff. Who takes the body? Why would they take the body with them? And then he said, maybe she was a goddess and she's been taken up to heaven. Pretty much anyone in the first century who reads a story of an empty tomb, whether it's fiction or fact, they're going to say one of two options. Probably a third option, you got the wrong tomb, but leave that out.
Right.
Somebody stole the body. Maybe the body was beautifully adorned or something with jewels, and they just took the body fast rather than... So grave robbery or assumed into heaven. Those were the options. Now, the second question is more important. Why is Mark the first one to say this and the only one that has it? I say the only one because Matthew and Luke simply copied from him, as we know. And for me at least, though it's a disputed in scholarship, I think John copied it. Now, why would Mark, let me use the term, invent this story? And I would say if you're reading through Mark carefully, you know he's going to have a real problem, because according to Paul, writing in the 50s, that's 20 years before that, Jesus appears to Peter. Well, now, Mark has spent his whole gospel knocking Peter, pretty much. And up to the time where Peter refuses to know Jesus, remember, not betrays him, but denies him.
Right.
So how is he going to end his gospel? How is Mark going to end his gospel if from the beginning Peter has been called Satan? He's, of course, the leader of the 12, certainly, but he ends up denying Jesus. 12 doesn't do very well in Mark's gospel. Mark, as far as I am concerned, creates. That's another word for invents. That's another word for makes up. The parable of the empty tomb. It's the same way as Jesus made up the Good Samaritan or the prodigal son. He made up this story in order not to have an apparition. He does not want visions. He says, go up to Galilee and whatever. Maybe there will be. Another reason, of course, for that is that Mark is writing in the throes of the Great War, soon after 70. And, you know, when Jerusalem was being burned to the ground, where was Jesus? So Mark isn't into these, I'm going to use a kind of a cruder, happy-go-lucky endings, where Jesus had a horrible day on Friday, but by Sunday everything's fine. That's not Mark.
Mm-hmm.
Mark is the one who says, my God, why hast thou forsaken me? And he's saying that not so much for Jesus as for his own people. Where was Jesus, or God for that matter, during the Great War? If they were in Jerusalem or in Judea or anywhere in Israel, as the Roman onslaught came down from north to south. So I consider that Mark very deliberately created the empty tomb story and intended, of course, that any contemporary reader would say, well, either the body was stolen or he's been taken up to God. And we Christians, of course, consider he's been taken up to God. We don't think the body was stolen in somewhere because we didn't do it.
Right.
Who else would have bothered? So as far as they're concerned, now we're talking about Mark's gospel. Matthew will create his own story about that, about the guards and all the rest of it.
Exactly.
But if you take Mark and read him carefully all the way through and know the time he wrote, it makes absolute sense that he doesn't want to end with kind of a happy-go-lucky. Everything's fine. because that's not what his people experienced. Jerusalem was burned to the ground. We fled. We got away. We lost everything. And now, where were the visions? Where was Jesus? My God, hast thou forsaken us? Is the chant that reverberates from Mark's gospel. So I consider it's not a myth. It's not, but it's a deliberately made up story in order not to tell something he knows for 20 years before, that Paul knows, that there were apparitions to the apostles and to Peter.
If I may probe you on that, just because
Sure.
this is a little off the beaten path of the intention of the overall video, but I think it's important for the viewers who will appreciate this. I wrote an article, the only article on academia.edu. I call it the minimal doubts argument, to show that there's an ongoing tradition of doubt that's found by the apostles, the earliest witnesses, on we shouldn't just take their word and literally accept that this literally happened. Like Thomas, I think Jesus breaks the fourth wall, so to speak, and says, blessed are you who don't believe, to the reader, blessed are you. So I'm a little bit persuaded by James Tabor and your kind of rhetoric here that there may be even a riff in the early community, enough so between the apostles and Pauline type school that Mark might actually be in line with Paul. I mean, it's a guess on my part, but the women went and told no one, for they were afraid. No one knew about it. He didn't tell. They don't go and tell the 12. Matthew has to add to it. What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. Mark is 20 years after Paul, roughly. So I want Mark to be Mark. Now, what Matthew and Luke are doing is damage control on Mark. Mark says the women fled and told nobody. Right away, Matthew says they met Jesus, and Jesus tells them what to do. So he cleans it up the way it's supposed to be. Luke has a whole bunch of stories. So has John. Mark is the one out of step. And of course, they all pick up the story. And once Mark tells a story, they can't get away from the empty tomb. But here's one other thing. Read very carefully. Now, being very conscious that these are copied from other. Mark, the best Mark could come up with was a hurried burial by a pious Jew. That's all he can say. That's hope as far as I'm concerned, not history. If you don't know what happened to your beloved Jesus, your best hope is that some pious Jew wouldn't leave the body there like Tobias in the story of Tobias. Somebody must have buried him. Surely somebody buried him. Now move on to Matthew and Luke. He's got a beautiful tomb. It's a tomb that nobody's been laid in. The tomb, we know who owns it. Move on to John. Magnificent burial in a garden tomb. I don't laugh at this because I see this is what people do when somebody they love has been killed and they don't have a body.
Dom, I love you. I appreciate you. Thank you for your wisdom, your insight, and I hope this helps viewers understand where you're coming from.
Yes. Thank you very, very much. Always good to be with you, Derek. Take care.
As well.
Marcus Borg, another member of the Jesus Seminar, states that Jesus' execution is the most certain fact about the historical Jesus.
Just want to make the point. I actually tend to agree with this quote, right? So most certain fact about the historical Jesus, the way I interpret this quote by Marcus Borg is saying, if there's anything we should have the highest amount of confidence in about the historical Jesus, it would be that he was crucified. Simple. He got killed. That no matter what, the dude was killed. That's fine with me.
But it's like the specifics of crucifixion. That's an extra. That to say that Jesus died from crucifixion would be one step up from saying he died.
I mean, how did he die?
He died from execution and then died. Yeah, it's so the most certain thing is that Jesus died.
Some scholars think he could have even potentially been stoned to death, right? Like you see Stephen stoned to death in Acts by Jews, which would have been the law on how they would have done it. The Gospels portray it where Jesus is crucified by Romans. Many scholars think that Jesus made an attempt on the temple, which we get that scene of him whipping people and flipping over money changers, and that's what got him killed. There are different Gospels that say different things that don't agree with that. How Jesus was killed and the exact order and even the context of things that happened during his crucifixion all vary and differ between gospels. It's just something that you got to look carefully at and see the synoptics and including John side by side to notice those differences. But which one's the accurate historical account of what actually happened? I think that the gist is, well, he was crucified, he was executed. That seems to be the overwhelming weight. Okay, I'll go with the guy got killed. Got it.
Jewish scholar Pinchas Lapid affirms that Jesus' death by crucifixion is historically certain.
I think there's a Jewish source too, by the way. And some religious Jews have it built into their Talmudic Judaism, it seems. And I may be overstepping this, but from my observation, I don't know of religious Jews, and I don't know who this scholar is, but I don't know of any religious Jew who denies Jesus existed historically, that's an Orthodox Jew, or that also doesn't go down the path of Jesus being crucified, because this is something they have in their own rabbinic writings. So they'd have to disagree with their own rabbinic writings about Jesus being crucified. But these are later. I mean, you can take Josephus, but I'm talking about Jewish writings later.
According to Paula Fredrickson, a convert to Judaism, the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion.
Man, that quote is amazing, because I don't think he sees, even in that quote, the implication. Jesus was an insurrectionist, according to this kind of quote. Jesus he's crucified between two criminals because he's innocent. I mean, you have to almost blindly just believe what the Bible says, right? And this is what I did my whole life, and not realize that if you grant the history to this, if you grant that Jesus was tried by Pontius Pilate and then condemned, even if you want to say he washed his hands and acting like Pontius Pilate's innocent of the blood and then blame the Jews, as you know, the Gospels say, let his blood be on us. Even if you grant that, this guy ends up getting punished for a crime that puts him in with the rest of the rebels, with the rest of the insurrectionists against Rome. That's a huge red flag, I would say, because we have other examples of insurrectionists list in the book of Acts that are, I think, Acts knows Josephus. That's a whole nother discussion. I mean, we could go into that, but at the end of the day, you have Theudas, you have Judas the Galilean, the Egyptian, you have several messianic looking claimants like Jesus. The only difference is Acts says, well, kind of paints the narrative that if this Christian one exists, it still stays alive, then it must be from God. But Jesus is getting crucified next to two insurrectionists, rebels of the Roman Empire. Why? What is going on here? It's huge red flag. But I've interviewed Paula Fredrickson. I'm actually one of the only YouTubers ever. There's only been big news stations who've ever interviewed her. And I flew to Boston just to sit in person and interview her. And then it is her opinion that if you can find it in Paul's letters about Jesus being crucified, you follow into the Gospels that he's also crucified there. She's just drawing a line back from these legendary accounts into Paul and saying, yeah, it seems pretty confident that Jesus was crucified.
Yeah, fair enough. I mean, to me, all of these quotes, I should imagine that this might be impressive to some Christians watching. Wow, look at all of this evidence that he's putting forward. But it honestly, it's suppose that you were trying to demonstrate that Spider-Man exists, and then you just listed off all of these quotes of scholars saying that New York is a real thing, and it just doesn't do anything. What we need here is meat on the bones.